20 years ago, earning a six-figure income was widely seen as a sign that you had made it. It meant stability. It meant opportunity. For many families, it meant finally having enough room to think about the future instead of worrying about the next bill. Today, something feels different. Across the United States, millions of households are earning more money than previous generations ever did. Yet many describe the same unsettling feeling. They don't feel wealthier. They don't feel more secure, and despite doing nearly everything they were told to do, building careers, buying homes, saving for retirement, they often feel as though they are running harder simply to remain in the same place. The numbers appear to tell one story. Paychecks have grown, home values have risen, household wealth has reached record levels for many homeowners, but everyday life tells another. Insurance premiums keep climbing, property taxes rise almost unnoticed, healthcare consumes a larger share of income, childcare rivals mortgage payments. Even routine decisions begin carrying unexpected financial weight. Perhaps the American dream has not disappeared. Perhaps it has simply become more expensive to maintain. And that distinction may explain why so many middle-class families feel financially exhausted, despite appearing successful on paper. To understand why, we first need to look beyond salaries and ask a more important question. What does it actually cost to stand still in modern America? There is a common belief that today's financial anxiety can be explained by a single word: inflation. Prices went up, purchasing power declined, and households became more stressed. While there is truth in that explanation, it is also incomplete. Inflation helps explain why groceries cost more than they did a few years ago. It does not fully explain why so many middle-class families feel that every major life decision has become significantly more difficult. The deeper story is not about one expense. It is about the growing number of expenses that have become fixed. Economists often distinguish between discretionary spending and fixed costs. Discretionary spending includes vacations, dining out, entertainment, or luxury purchases. These are expenses families can reduce when money becomes tight. Fixed costs are different: housing, insurance, healthcare, utilities, transportation, childcare, property taxes. These are expenses that cannot simply be skipped next month. Over the past several decades, many of these essential costs have increased faster than wages. Not every year, not in every region, but over time, the trend has become increasingly difficult to ignore. This creates an important shift in how households experience financial pressure. Imagine receiving a salary increase of 5%. At first, it feels like progress. Then the mortgage payment rises because of higher insurance premiums. Property taxes increase after a reassessment. Health insurance deductibles climb again. Car insurance renews at a higher rate. Electricity costs edge upward during the summer. Suddenly, the raise has already been absorbed before it reaches the family budget. The paycheck grows. The room to breathe does not. This helps explain one of the most puzzling features of today's economy. Many households are not necessarily earning too little. They are spending an increasing share of their income simply maintaining the same standard of living. The burden is cumulative. Housing offers perhaps the clearest example. For much of the 20th century, housing costs generally left room for other financial goals. Families could save, invest, start businesses, plan for retirement. Today, housing often functions as the largest fixed expense in a household budget, leaving less flexibility for everything else. But housing is no longer the only pressure. Insurance has become an increasingly significant financial burden. Homeowners in many parts of the country have seen premiums rise sharply due to higher rebuilding costs, more frequent natural disasters, and changing risk assessments. Auto insurance has followed a similar trajectory, driven by more expensive vehicle repairs, advanced technology, and rising replacement costs. Unlike discretionary purchases, insurance is not optional for most households. Its rising cost quietly reshapes monthly budgets without improving daily quality of life. Healthcare follows a similar pattern. Medical advances have improved treatment options and extended life expectancy in many areas. Yet, for many working families, healthcare has also become one of the least predictable parts of the household budget. Premiums, deductibles, prescription costs, and unexpected medical bills create uncertainty that extends far beyond routine expenses. Even households with employer-sponsored insurance often discover that being insured does not necessarily mean being insulated from rising costs. Then there is childcare. In many metropolitan areas, annual childcare expenses rival tuition at public universities. For younger families, this creates a difficult equation. One parent's income may barely exceed the cost of childcare itself. The decision to continue working becomes more complex than simply comparing salaries. It becomes a calculation involving commuting costs, taxes, career progression, and long-term financial stability. Each individual expense can be explained on its own. Housing reflects supply constraints. Insurance reflects higher risks. Healthcare reflects technological complexity. Education reflects labor shortages. Viewed separately, each increase appears rational. Viewed together, they reveal something larger. The middle-class budget is gradually becoming less flexible. This is where the conversation shifts. The problem is no longer simply that life costs more. The problem is that an increasing share of household income is committed before families have the opportunity to choose how to spend it. Choice itself becomes more expensive, and when financial flexibility begins to disappear, the consequences extend far beyond monthly budgets. They begin influencing careers, family decisions, personal ambitions, and even the way people define success. To understand what that feels like in everyday life, we need to step inside the home of a family that appears, from every outside measure, to be doing remarkably well. Mark and Jennifer never considered themselves wealthy, but by most traditional measures, they were doing well. They both held full-time professional jobs outside Columbus, Ohio. Mark worked as an operations manager for a manufacturing company. Jennifer was a registered nurse at a regional hospital. Together, they earned just over $185,000 a year. 20 years ago, that income would have placed them comfortably within what many Americans imagined as the upper middle class. Instead, it often felt as though they were constantly trying to catch up. Their mortgage consumed a significant portion of their monthly budget, not because they had purchased a luxury home. It was an ordinary 4-bedroom house in a quiet suburban neighborhood where they had hoped to raise their 2 children. When they bought it several years earlier, the payment seemed manageable. Since then, almost everything surrounding that mortgage had become more expensive. Homeowners insurance increased after severe storms affected their region. Property taxes rose as home values climbed. Maintenance costs followed inflation, making even routine repairs noticeably more expensive than they had expected. The house itself had become more valuable. Living in it had become more expensive. Their vehicles told a similar story. Neither drove luxury cars. One SUV carried the family through school activities, grocery trips, and weekend visits to grandparents. The other was a reliable sedan used for commuting. Both vehicles were paid off, yet their auto insurance premiums kept increasing. When Jennifer opened the renewal notice one evening, she assumed there had been a mistake. Nothing about their driving history had changed. No accidents, no traffic violations, yet the premium had climbed again. The explanation was simple. Repair costs had increased. Replacement parts were more expensive. Vehicles contained more advanced technology than ever before. The family accepted the increase because they had little choice. The same pattern appeared almost everywhere they looked. Their health insurance still came through Jennifer's employer, but deductibles rose steadily. Prescription costs fluctuated. Routine doctor visits became another expense to budget carefully, rather than casually. Their oldest daughter would soon begin applying to colleges. Instead of celebrating the next stage of her education, Mark and Jennifer found themselves opening spreadsheets. Tuition, housing, books, transportation. Even with financial aid, the numbers seemed intimidating. The conversation around the dinner table slowly changed. It was no longer about what their daughter wanted to study. It was about what the family could realistically afford. Perhaps the most frustrating part was what did not appear on any financial statement. The opportunities they quietly declined. Mark had once considered launching a small consulting business using the experience he had built over 2 decades. He had even drafted a business plan. But walking away from employer-sponsored health insurance suddenly felt too risky. Jennifer had thought about reducing her hours to spend more time with aging parents. Yet losing a portion of the household income would immediately tighten a budget that already felt stretched. Neither decision was driven by fear alone. They were driven by arithmetic. Every major life choice now carried a higher financial threshold than it once had. Friends occasionally commented on how fortunate they were. After all, they owned a home. They had stable careers. They took a family vacation every year, although those trips had gradually become shorter and closer to home. From the outside, they represented financial success. From the inside, success felt increasingly expensive to maintain. One evening, after reviewing the monthly budget, Jennifer looked across the kitchen table and asked a question neither of them could answer. When did a good life start feeling this complicated? There had been no financial disaster, no reckless spending, no catastrophic mistake. Only a steady accumulation of costs that arrived one after another, each reasonable on its own. Together, they changed how the family thought about the future. The American dream had not disappeared from their lives. It had simply become more expensive to sustain. And if one family's experience reflected a broader pattern, then the story was no longer about household budgeting. It was about the changing economics of the American middle class itself. Mark and Jennifer's story may feel deeply personal, but it is also remarkably ordinary. Across the United States, countless households are reaching similar conclusions. Not because they made poor financial decisions, but because the rules governing everyday life have quietly changed. The traditional middle-class formula was built on a simple assumption. As income increased, financial flexibility would increase alongside it. Higher earnings meant more choices. A larger emergency fund, more savings, greater freedom to change careers, relocate, start a business, or retire comfortably. For many families today, that relationship has weakened. Income still matters, but what matters just as much is how much of that income is already spoken for before a family makes its first discretionary purchase. This shift represents something economists sometimes describe as the fixed cost economy. In previous generations, a larger share of household spending was discretionary. Families could adjust their budgets without fundamentally changing their lives. If money became tight, vacations could wait. Restaurant visits became less frequent. Large purchases were postponed. Today's financial pressures operate differently. The fastest growing expenses are often the least flexible. Housing payments arrive every month. Insurance premiums renew regardless of income growth. Healthcare expenses remain unpredictable. Utilities cannot simply be switched off. Property taxes continue rising with assessed values. These costs consume income before families begin making meaningful financial choices. The result is subtle but profound. Households become less resilient, not because they lack income, because they have less room to absorb unexpected change. Financial resilience has always depended on margin, the difference between what a household earns and what it must spend. When that margin narrows, even relatively small disruptions begin carrying outsized consequences. A temporary job loss, an unexpected medical expense, a major home repair, a parent needing long-term care. Individually, none of these events are unusual. But in a household where nearly every dollar already has a destination, flexibility disappears quickly. This helps explain another paradox of the modern economy. Consumer spending has remained surprisingly resilient in many periods. Restaurants remain busy. Airports remain crowded. Shopping centers continue attracting customers. From a distance, the economy appears healthy. Yet, surveys repeatedly suggest that many Americans feel financially stressed despite continued employment and rising nominal incomes. These observations are not necessarily contradictory. People can continue participating in the economy while simultaneously feeling less financially secure. Confidence is shaped not only by what people spend today, it is shaped by what they believe they could handle tomorrow. If an unexpected expense feels increasingly difficult to absorb, financial anxiety grows even during periods of economic expansion. This is where housing reconnects with the larger picture. A home is no longer simply the largest purchase most families make. It has become the center of an expanding network of financial obligations. Mortgage payments, insurance, property taxes, maintenance, utilities. Each component reflects a different part of the economy: construction costs, climate risk, local government finance, labor shortages, energy markets. What appears to be a single monthly payment is actually the meeting point of multiple structural forces, and those forces rarely move in the same direction. As one expense stabilizes, another often rises. Families adapt, then adapt again. Eventually, adaptation becomes a permanent condition. There is another consequence that receives far less attention. Risk tolerance begins to change. Historically, the American economy benefited from individuals willing to take calculated risks. People changed careers, started companies, moved across the country, returned to school, accepted temporary uncertainty in pursuit of long-term opportunity. Those decisions become more difficult when fixed costs consume a larger share of household income. Leaving a stable job may also mean losing employer-sponsored health insurance. Starting a business may require sacrificing predictable cash flow needed to cover housing costs. Relocating for a better opportunity may involve replacing an affordable mortgage with a far more expensive one. None of these barriers prohibit change. They simply make change more expensive. Over time, millions of rational individual decisions begin producing a larger national pattern. Workers stay where they are. Entrepreneurs delay launching businesses. Older employees postpone retirement. Younger families postpone having children. Communities become less dynamic. Economic mobility slows, not because ambition has disappeared, but because the financial cost of acting on that ambition continues to rise. Perhaps this is the most important distinction. The American dream has never promised that success would be easy. It promised that progress would remain possible. But when the cost of maintaining stability grows faster than the ability to create new opportunity, the definition of progress itself begins to change. And once that happens, the consequences are measured not only in dollars, but in the way people think about their future. For most middle-class families, financial pressure no longer arrives as a single crisis. It arrives quietly: a higher insurance renewal, a larger property tax bill, another increase in childcare costs, a medical deductible that resets every January. None of these expenses are catastrophic on their own, yet together they create something far more powerful than any single bill. They create the feeling that life is becoming increasingly expensive simply to maintain. Psychologists often describe stress as the gap between demands and perceived control. That distinction matters. Many Americans are not overwhelmed because they lack income. They are overwhelmed because they feel they have less control over where that income goes. Every raise seems to disappear before it reaches their checking account. Every financial victory feels temporary. Every budget adjustment feels like a response rather than a choice. This gradual loss of financial agency changes behavior in subtle ways. People become more cautious. They postpone renovations, delay replacing aging vehicles, travel less frequently, visit family less often. They begin evaluating every major decision through a single question: can we really afford to change anything? Ironically, this mindset often develops among families who appear financially successful. Their neighbors see a comfortable home, reliable cars, stable careers, annual vacations. What remains invisible is the constant mental calculation happening behind the scenes. Every purchase is weighed against future uncertainty. Every unexpected expense reopens conversations about long-term security. Financial pressure becomes less about mathematics and more about attention. It occupies mental space. Researchers sometimes refer to this as the cognitive burden of scarcity. When people constantly manage limited financial flexibility, a portion of their mental energy becomes permanently devoted to planning, adjusting, and anticipating future expenses. Even relatively secure households can experience this effect when their financial margin becomes increasingly narrow. The result is not panic, it is fatigue. Decision fatigue, planning fatigue, future fatigue. People stop asking, "What do we want to do next?" Instead, they begin asking, "What can we safely avoid changing?" Over time, this psychological shift affects more than spending habits. It reshapes identity. For generations, the American middle class associated success with forward movement, a larger home, a better neighborhood, a promotion, starting a business, sending children to college, retiring with confidence. Progress was expected. Today, many households still achieve these milestones, but each one requires more planning, more financial precision, and more resilience than before. The destination may look familiar. The journey feels fundamentally different. Perhaps that explains why surveys consistently show a disconnect between economic indicators and public sentiment. Employment may remain relatively strong. Household incomes may continue to rise. Asset values may appreciate. Yet confidence often lags behind the statistics because people do not evaluate their financial lives by looking at national averages. They evaluate them by asking a much simpler question: does tomorrow feel more manageable than yesterday? For a growing number of Americans, the answer has become increasingly uncertain, not because they believe success is impossible, but because maintaining the life they have already built now requires more effort than they ever expected. And when an entire generation begins feeling that stability itself has become expensive, the conversation is no longer just about household budgets. It becomes a question about how the American dream is quietly being redefined for the decades ahead. For generations, the American dream was often described as a destination: earn a good living, buy a home, raise a family, save for retirement. Each milestone represented progress, and each step forward was expected to create new opportunities rather than new obligations. That vision still exists. Millions of Americans continue to work hard, purchase homes, build careers, and invest in their futures. The foundations of the dream have not disappeared. What has changed is the cost of maintaining it. The modern middle class is increasingly asked to absorb higher housing costs, rising insurance premiums, more expensive health care, growing education expenses, and countless smaller obligations that quietly accumulate over time. No single bill transforms a family's future. Instead, it is the combined weight of many essential costs that gradually reshapes how people think, plan, and live. Perhaps that is why this shift feels so difficult to define. There is no single event that marks its beginning. No headline announces its arrival. It unfolds through thousands of ordinary decisions made around kitchen tables across the country: a vacation postponed, a move delayed, a business idea abandoned, a retirement pushed back by another year. None of these choices seem historic on their own. Together, they tell the story of an economy where preserving stability often requires more effort than creating progress. And that may be the quiet transformation unfolding beneath the surface of modern America. Perhaps the American dream has not become undetainable. Perhaps it has become increasingly expensive simply to sustain. If that trend continues, the defining challenge for the next generation may not be achieving success. It may be holding on to it